Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I think we can get started now. Um, Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting from today and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. We pay our respects to elders, both past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're probably dialing in from various different Aboriginal lands, and I personally would like to acknowledge the Darkinjung people of the central coast of New South Wales, from where I'm dialing from today. Okay, so just before we get started, please be aware that today's session will be recorded, although your mics and video will be muted for the presentation section. Um, We might be able to open up things later for a Q&A section. Otherwise, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type into the chat function. So this webinar series, certainly if you've joined us in previous webinars, is aimed at both job seekers living with physical disability, as well as employers who have an interest in strengthening diversity and inclusion, especially around the topic of disability. So I want you to imagine, have you ever entered a room, maybe at a party, and the whole place goes quiet? Everyone turns to look at you. Is it your controversial outfit? Perhaps it's a new hairstyle that went tragically wrong. At least that's something you can change. I think we agree it's not great to feel unwelcome, especially because of the way you look or the way you are. So imagine then turning up to an interview or even the first day at work in your new job, everyone's staring. Maybe you can't even get into the building to do your job. When you get to your desk, you realize you can't even use your desk because it's the wrong height, or even the computer. So for many people living with physical disability, this is the reality, and it doesn't need to be this way. So my name is Phat, and I'm the Employability Manager here at Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. I've been working in the employment services sector, both in the UK and Australia since 2006, and in disability employment specifically for nearly a decade. And I'm delighted to say that I'll be your webinar host today. So I'm really excited to introduce today's webinar topic, how to become a disability-friendly employer. As you can imagine, it's a wide-ranging topic. So in today's session, we're going to be taking a bit of a tour through the main areas that employers need to focus on if they are to become disability friendly and disability inclusive employers, and to become, I guess, agents of change so that in the future workplaces and workspaces are fully inclusive to people with all abilities and a welcoming and safe space for all of us. So we'll cover things like inclusive language, job adverts, inclusive recruitment, interview processes, as well as talking about accessibility and workplace modifications. And we'll also touch on where you can get support to make all of this happen in your workspace. So I think if we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion, it might be useful to start with a bit of a discussion on the key topic for us, and that's disability. So what is disability? So if you're looking at a broad definition, disability can be defined as a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movement, senses, or activities. But when it comes to employment, I think it's quite useful to look at disability through a variety of different lenses. So they could be sensory, intellectual, for example, ASD, so autism spectrum, psychosocial, acquired brain impairment or brain injury, and that's ABI. And finally, physical disability, and that's the focus of our discussion today. So understanding the different types of disability that may exist within your workforce currently or with prospective new employees, it's vital if you're going to really become a fully inclusive disability friendly employer, as it will help you harness the full potential of your team members. So if you're an employer in our audience today, well done for making that first move towards becoming a disability inclusive employer. So before we move into the meat and bones of the topic today, I think it's important to touch on some statistics that will really help to set the scene when it comes to disability within the context of the employment world. So as you can see, around 4.4 million people in Australia live with disability, and that's around 1 in 6 people. Yet, according to the statistics given here by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, more than 113,000 people with disability are currently unemployed and looking for work. So, to demonstrate how those challenges play out, here's a very sad looking chart. Um, if you can't see the figures there, we're basically looking at um, for people without disability, 3.7% of unemployment of the working population, but people with disability, that's almost triple at 10%. And it's worse still if you consider the statistic for people living with severe disability, which is closer to quadruple the 3.7% rate. So what's going wrong? A number of different things, as you can imagine. One aspect often not spoken about really is the perception that people with disabilities have of themselves and their ability to find work. And this could be, it might be through finding the various challenges of looking for work. For a person with disability as being insurmountable, which can often knock confidence. And sadly, despite having the actual skills and experience to do the job, um, many consider finding work something that is out of their reach. So, secondly, and very relevant for the discussion today, is the misperceptions that employers have when it comes to hiring people with disabilities. So, I'm excited to be spending that time today, spending time to open up this topic, which I don't think gets enough traction, gets enough exposure, and it needs to change if we're going to change for the better, and especially if we're going to drive employment opportunities for people with disability in the future. So, although there are some pretty important regulations as well as legislation like the Disability Discrimination Act in 1992, um, being a diverse and inclusive employer isn't just about ticking boxes to meet compliance. And if done properly, it can really bring about some significant additional value to your organization. So we'll touch on some of those benefits shortly. We looked at some recent studies from the government's Job Access Department and found that 68%, as you can see there, of respondents agree that organizations have a duty to employ a diverse workforce. And more importantly, 60% agree that employers should be actively trying to employ people with disabilities. So there's clearly an appetite within the general workforce for organizations to embrace diversity and inclusion. So let's take a look at some of those benefits that we mentioned earlier. So an access to an untapped talent pool, what does that mean? So as we mentioned before, there are 116,000 people living with disability in Australia looking for work. And the chances are, as employers, you may not have been looking at this candidate pool previously. So we've got high retention rates and lower staff turnover there. So a number of workplace studies have shown that retention rates among people with disability are generally higher than for their counterparts who live without disability. This could be for a number of reasons. So, um, having worked in the sector myself for nearly a decade, I can testify that there's a real sense of loyalty that's built within this group. And I think that's fostered through this mutual sense of trust between the employer and the employee. So, with the employee really keen to repay that trust and that ongoing trust with loyalty. And it goes without saying that the average cost of a new hire is well over 10,000 thousand per new hire to the business. So lower staff turnover is obviously a huge benefit. So we've also got their lower instances of staff sickness and absenteeism, and that's linked to that last point that I made there. There's a massive misperception that people with disability will take lots of sick leave, whereas the actual fact is actually quite the opposite. Lived experience perspective, valuable for employees in the disability space. So that's really talking about if you're actually an employer within the disability space and you're taking on people with that lived experience, it's going to obviously add that value and give you that lived experience lens. Um, the next one there, I've got positive social footprint and stronger public image, which kind of speaks for itself, but it really enhances reputation of your company. Expanding your customer base, so having that better knowledge of customers with disability would allow you to connect to that cohort. And finally, positive workplace culture. So through having a more inclusive workplace, you're able to, I mean, it does speak for itself a little bit, but as we saw earlier, you know, the majority of people really do value diversity and inclusion in the place that they work. So I thought it was important to talk about job adverts. So why is it important? Well, language matters. And when you're putting communications out there, whether that's a job advert or social media stuff, and being aware of appropriate terminology relating to disability and inclusion and inclusive language in general is really important. So being able to think about important things like focusing on actual skills and competencies in job adverts rather than the type of person that you're looking for, trying to avoid industry jargon and focusing on simple, clear, and relevant information, focusing on the skill set that you need rather than the specific job that needs to be done, unless, of course, it's a highly specialized requirement that you need to highlight. And it's really useful to show your commitment in real terms on the job advert by including an inclusive statement in your job description. So I've got an example here, and it might be a little bit hard to read this, but we will be sharing this in the slides after the webinar in case you can't. But I'll just highlight a few of the details for now. So you can see in the PD, it's quite a straightforward language. We're not using jargon in there. It's easy to understand. It really clearly explains what skills are needed to perform the role. And it also encourages explicitly people with disability to apply using that lived experience to contribute to the success of the team. We've also got there, it highlights the level of flexibility provided in the case of the ability to work from home, as well as a variety of shift options, which can be really crucial for a person living with disability to work around, any needs that they may have. And finally, hopefully you can see at the end there, there's a strong diversity, equality, and inclusion statement. Okay, so one thing we've learned is that a significant number of people with visible physical disabilities, wheelchair users, for example, who manage to get to the interview stage, have provided lots of stories of negative experiences. So some have shared accounts of being surprised by going into the interview room and seeing faces lit up with surprise, as sometimes they've been looked up and down, some sadly not even able to get into the building to actually do the interview. So creating an inclusive interview experience means being proactive with your interview process, regardless of whether you're aware or not of a candidate's disability. So with over 93% of people recently surveyed stating that they actually get anxiety prior to interview, and I can raise my hand and testify that I am one of those 93%. Adding disability into the mix makes that experience even more challenging, as you can see. So let's take a look at a few things that you can consider when creating a more inclusive interview process. Okay, so creating an inclusive interview process starts long before the actual interview itself. So you can check if the prospective candidate has any special requirements to attend the interview, even if there hasn't been a disclosure of disability. So you can take that proactive step yourself. Sharing logistical information on the interview far in advance. As a rule, you can only ask how a person's disability might relate to doing a job. So you do need to avoid any language that just talks generally about someone's health or disability. Um, Now, the focus of questions should really be on how someone might perform the role rather than if someone can do the job. And be prepared at the end of the interview to answer any questions the individual may have on how you can accommodate people living with disability as an employer. Okay, so when it comes to workplace regulations, employers are actually required to make what we call reasonable adjustments for people living with disability to perform their jobs. Um, so some workplaces or job features may, I guess, present barriers to employment for people with disabilities, sometimes actually inadvertently. So it's an employer's responsibility to ensure that changes can be made to these features so that they don't discriminate against people with disability being able to do the job. So this is known as reasonable adjustment. So adjustments should be specific to the individual needs of the person and can relate to the actual workplace itself, the schedule of work or the roster, or modifications to equipment, so desks, IT equipment, that kind of thing. So these accommodations are essentially providing, I think, a level playing field and eliminating barriers for individuals with disability in the workplace. So let's take a look at what some of these reasonable adjustments might look like. Okay, so by far one of the most common reasonable adjustment requests isn't actually equipment and workplace modifications like you might assume. It's actually the second point there, flexible working arrangements. So this could be a change to start times and finish times to allow the person with disability to go through a morning self-care routine or organize support workers, for example, or giving the option to work from home and having that flexibility to be working from their own comfortable environment if needed. You've got a few other points there. So assistive technology, like we've mentioned before, restructuring the job as well. So just looking at certain parts of the role and whether uh, duties can be divided into different aspects so that a person with a wheelchair user, for example, can in fact perform certain parts of the job, and other physically demanding areas of the job that they may not be able to do can be uh, given to other members of the team. And then we talk about accessible communication, and then making sure that there's a needs-based tailoring of training and development for those individuals. Okay, we touched on it a little bit before, but language can significantly influence workplace culture. And inclusive language is language that avoids bias, avoids stereotypes, as well as discriminates. It's important to ensure that the language used across everything that you do, so websites, job adverts, job descriptions, all your email communications, marketing, social media profiles, all the posts that you do, the signage also within the building itself and across your workspace, making sure that that's inclusive and it doesn't dehumanize, and above all, it's respectful to every cohort, every group of people that is potentially joining your team. So we strongly believe that using what we call, I guess, a person first language approach, we think that's a really good way to emphasize the person and view the disorder or the disease, the condition or disability as just part of that whole person, describing what the person has rather than what the person is. So, in the context of disability, This includes using phrases like person living with disability rather than referring to disabled people. Let's take a look at a few examples. So whilst each individual has their own preferred terminology, everyone is different, everyone is unique. So we've just put some suggestions below on the slide here on how to use inclusive language. So using modern medical descriptors rather than outdated ones, I think is really important, certainly ones with negative connotations. So for example, we're talking about a person with physical disability, sorry, we're not referring to people as disabled. Emphasizing what a person with disability can do rather than what they can't. And I think changing the focus from disability to accessibility. So, for example, we've got there, a person who uses a wheelchair or a wheelchair user instead of someone who's wheelchair bound, which is a term that, has been used in the past, and certainly avoiding phrases like handicapped person. And remember to also avoid, I guess, putting undue emphasis on someone's disability and using emotive language to refer to people with disability. For example, using phrases like that person suffers from a disability. All right, so we've covered quite a lot of ground so far, but I thought it would be important just to touch on a couple of other important topics that also need consideration when it comes to disability inclusion. Um, Providing disability awareness education, opportunities, and training is absolutely vital if the wider team is to grow in their confidence in disability awareness. Also ensuring workplace policies and procedures are inclusive, and that's a big part or responsibility of the human resources team. Committing to a diverse workforce through proactive recruitment initiatives, which means not just talking about being more inclusive and doing all the training, which is a huge, move towards becoming inclusive, but making that an actual reality by employing people with disability. And of course, it's important to actually create the physical accessible workspace, including things like modified shared spaces, lunch facilities, eating areas, work desks, accessible toilets, of course, entrances to the building, just making sure that they're accessible to everyone. Okay, so hopefully you're further on board on this journey towards diversity and inclusion for people with disability, and you've learned about a lot of the things that you'll need to do to become that disability inclusive employer. And where can you go to get help to make this happen? So one of the main go-to resources is actually a government resource called Job Access. Job Access is the national hub in Australia for workplace and employment information for funding people with disability, employers and service providers. So through the EAF or Employment Assistance Fund, employers actually have access to funding, which can cover the cost of making certain workplace modifications, changes to accessibility, things like that, to support employees with disability. This can include equipment modifications, accessibility changes, also engaging with providers like ourselves to actually provide staff disability awareness training and accessing services, other services for people with disability. There's actually also the last point there, a disability employment services wage subsidy scheme, which offers wage subsidies to offer ongoing employment to employ people with disability, and that's something that we can talk to you in depth about if you want to get in contact with us after the webinar. All right, you're probably tired of my voice now, so I will hand over and introduce Jemma Smyth. Jemma is our head of people and governance here at SCIA, and we're really proud of the disability inclusion standards here at SCIA, and Gemma's here to give us an insight into how we ensure diversity and inclusion lives within our own organisation. Over to you, Jemma.
Great, thank you, Phat. So as Phat mentioned, I am the head of people and governance at SCIA. And I've been working with the organisation for 5 years. So our organisation, as Phat mentioned, we're very passionate about basically leading by example. And we actually employ over 26% of our staff at SCIA are living with a disability, and a majority of our board also live with a disability. So what this essentially means is that our organisation is led, and the service that we provide, they're all informed by the lived experience of disability. You might think, yep, we're a disability service organisation and this is quite common, but it's actually not very common, which surprised me as well. There was a recent study conducted by the University of Sydney, which found that over a quarter of organisations in the disability sector did not employ anyone with a disability, and a further 20% of organisations had less than 3 people working with them. So this is organisations in the disability sector that would be more informed than other organisations about disability. So I guess you may think, what's the prevention? What are some of the things? And I myself came from a corporate background. I've worked in both HR and recruitment in the corporate sector in the past. And although I've always been passionate about diversity, I guess the reason why, from my observations prior to joining this organisation, is I think sometimes the main thing that comes about is from nervousness. And I think it's about people's lack of understanding sometimes, and there's all these regulations in place, and I think that sometimes scare people. So at SCIA, what I really learned from my time there is that the way to become an inclusive employer is to actually make sure that your policies apply to all people. It's not just people living with disability, but it's all people. And one of the biggest benefits of our organisation is the fact that we do have so many people that work with us that live with a disability, is that we truly have embodied flexible working practices. So our flexibility applies to all employees across the board. And what we found that does is that means that we're attracting not only people that are living with disability, but we're attracting a really broad range of people. So we have people, we've got 46% of our staff that work part-time or have a flexible work pattern. And this applies to people that have caring responsibility for younger children. We've got people with caring responsibility for older members of their family. We have young workers who've just entered the workforce who may be also studying or may have other interests that they're focusing on, not just on work. So they might have flexible work patterns. We've got people near retirement age that have requested flexible work patterns as they ease out of the workplace, but they want to maintain their skill set and some sort of level of interaction in the workplace. So that is one of the things at SCIA that I think we do really well. And it just means then that the people that are living with a disability aren't the only people that are actually requesting flexible work arrangements. So all in all, it means it's actually no big deal for anyone to request a flexible working arrangement at SCIA. What we have found from this is, first of all, the people that we have that work for us that live with a disability, their tenure is amazing. So the average tenure of our staff that are living with a disability is 9 years, which I think you'd all agree is a really impressive statistic. We've also found that our employees in general, because we've got such flexible work patterns, they want to hold on to that. So they're very productive when they're in the office because they want to make sure that the flexible work pattern works and that they can maintain that work-life balance. So the other thing I wanted to touch on is just coming back to the regulations. So we all understand that there are regulations in place that employers need to meet. And as I mentioned before, I think sometimes the resistance to employ people, not even resistance, but the nervousness about employing people from disability can come because the frameworks seem so arduous and people might think, oh, I'm not an expert and I don't actually know how to accommodate that. So I'm just going to, not deal with it. But I think the most important thing to remember here is that people living with a disability are experts in their own personal requirements. And all you really need to do is consult with people. And this is actually something that we do as an organisation. So I do have on one of my points on the slide is that we have a very strong consultation process to try to understand the lived experience perspective beyond the regulations, because even after 5 years working in this organisation, I am not an expert on disability, and I don't think anyone is an expert on disability, because everyone that lives with a disability has unique needs, and all it really needs is a conversation. But generally, the people that are living with a disability will be able to tell you exactly what sort of adjustments they need in order to perform their role well. And they're very aware of what they need to be successful. So all you really need to do is to start the conversation. Once again, coming back to the fact that all people living with a disability have different needs, is that we do some disability awareness training for our staff, even though we work in the disability sector and we have staff that might have had experience before working in the disability sector. The lived experience training that we have, once again, really does bring some of those practical barriers into it, just really makes you aware of it. And it really resonates when you've got someone telling you their story of their lived experience. And so our disability awareness training that we have for our staff is actually facilitated by people that have disabilities themselves, and they actually speak about the day-to-day barriers that they face, and that creates awareness. So there's some things that I've learned, once again, that I would not have even had awareness of before working at SCIA. Things such as, you might have a really accessible building, but if you're on a busy road and there's not a crossing nearby, that can take a person a lot longer to get to your building if they have to go a really long way around. So if there's not a cover over walkways, that can actually mean that when the person gets to work, they could be really wet. So there's just things that I think the lived experience can really give you some insight into. So I just recommend that if you are employing people, or even if you're not employing people with disability yet, that giving that lived experience training will just give you some awareness about what are the types of things you need to be aware of for people. And then just lastly, I'd like to touch on the fact that, as I mentioned, not everyone's an expert, and we don't expect everyone to be an expert. And I think people living with a disability don't expect everyone to be an expert. But for more complex requirements, there is people that can help you. So as Phat mentioned before, there's lots of government support that can facilitate for those reasonable adjustments that are a little bit more complex. So where the adjustment isn't as simple as a flexible work pattern, then there is job access that can help you with getting access, like getting equipment to help people be able to perform the best in their role. They can help do ergonomic assessments to make sure that your work setup is correct. They can get an occupational therapist to come in. And then there's also obviously the Employment Assistance Fund, which can help with making a building accessible as well. And there is that experts that you can draw on. So just want to make sure that people understand, and we can always, as part of our organisation, can always assist with linking to those experts as well. So that's where I will leave it. I'd like to thank everyone for listening today, and hope our lived experience of disability has given some good tips. But I will pass back to Phat now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Jemma. Okay, so we're almost finished with the webinar today, actually, but I wanted to spend a few moments just talking through our Building Employer Confidence program, which is basically designed to support employers across Australia become more confident, disability confident, and confident around your diversity and inclusion, specifically around disability. So there's a bit of a flow here of 4 stages, and I'll quickly talk to those 4 stages because they're really straightforward in terms of how we can support your journey towards disability inclusion. So the first stage there, as you can see, is a really comprehensive disability inclusion initial assessment. This is possibly the most important stage of the whole process because we take the time to take you through a series of questions that really assesses where you're at right now currently in terms of your journey towards disability inclusion. I think Jemma might have mentioned it earlier, but it's really important to understand that we're not here to catch anyone out in terms of organizations and companies out there looking to engage with our support. What we're here to do is to help you along that journey, identify where you're at right now, and from those questions, that series of answers from the initial assessment, we create a tailored action plan, which is stage 2 that you can see there. Now, from that action plan, we look to support your development through stage 3, which is the engaging in the learning and development modules, and we'll touch on those modules shortly. The final stage for me is absolutely vital. We've talked about this whole process of becoming a more inclusive organization. And I mentioned before about training and development being an integral part of supporting and helping people grow as organizations and workforces across Australia to become more diverse and more educated when it comes to the topic of disability. But really, real change for us comes through changing the makeup of that workforce. So for us, actually placing people with physical disability into the workforce, excuse me, is possibly the most important part of this whole process, because what we're actually trying to do is we're enacting actual change to the makeup of workforces across Australia and therefore cultures across Australia. So people are actually learning through this lived experience of change. So as you can see, we've ensured that no stone is unturned when it comes to disability inclusion. So here are the Building Employee Confidence learning modules. I'll just quickly run through them. We've got more generic kind of overview modules like building a confident workforce, enhancing workplace education, improving accessibility, developing the recruitment process that we touched on earlier, looking at your privacy and sensitivity, so HR related kind of topics. And then we've got overcoming discrimination and bias through language that we talked about earlier as well. Exploring workplace modification, so talking about accessibility and bringing in the likes of job access to support that process. And then finally, they're using the power of language. So we talked a lot before about where you can use more positive language when it comes to disability across your entire organization. Okay, so look, thank you so much for your time and taking the time out of your day to join us today. We've covered so much on how to be a disability friendly employer. Just a bit of a summary. We've talked about the importance of language, culture, inclusive communication. We've covered accessibility and workplace modifications. We've talked about an inclusive recruitment process, including the interview process. We also heard from Jemma about what it means to be an inclusive organisation and how that looks from an SCIA perspective. And lastly, we touched on the Building Employer Confidence Programme run by our very own EmployAbility team, focused on supporting employers become disability-friendly employers. So we've actually set aside a few minutes for some questions. So if you've got any questions, feel free to tap them into the chat function. I'm going to bring in Libby from our EmployAbility team to help us facilitate some of these questions. Hello, Libby.
Hello, thank you, Phat. We have had a few questions in the chat box already. So the first one, I work as the DE and I lead with a retail company, is there anything else I might need to consider given that the majority of our opportunities are in store?
Okay, so I can probably answer that one, Gemma. I think initially considerations like flexibility in terms of hours is always going to be important from a physical store, from a recruitment perspective for someone with physical disability. But from a physical store perspective, accessibility is absolutely vital. So, for example, for a wheelchair user, it's really important to understand your space, to understand whether people can actually navigate the workspace so that they can actually go ahead and do their job. This is actually going to help you with your, wheelchair user customers as well. So it's kind of a twofold kind of positive impact if you're really looking to assess your space for that reason. But also just looking at the job description as well. So, if you've got various different tasks, one might be managing customer service and point of sale, which is certainly accessible to a large number of people living with physical disabilities. But some tasks like managing stock or restocking shelves and merchandising, that kind of stuff, may be a bit more challenging. So being able to kind of understand and assess job descriptions from that perspective and separating the tasks so that you can actually create roles that are designed for certain people who might be able to perform a certain percentage of the role and maybe not another. So there's a few ideas for you.
Thank you. So you mentioned ensuring workplace policies are inclusive. What does this involve?
I can
I'll give that one to you, Gemma.
So I think that mentioned with the interview policy, it's creating policies that start from the interview process through to the exit process. And I think that it's ensuring that these policies are broad policies that apply to all staff. So for example, if someone doesn't have to disclose during the interview process that they have a disability. So in terms of onboarding, it should be asked in the onboarding. There should be a policy in onboarding that asks if anyone does have a reasonable adjustment that's required to the role. And then a policy that governs how that reasonable adjustment request is managed and assessed. And that's available to everyone. It's not just available to people that are living with a disability, but it's available across the board. So they're the things that I would recommend, is just having policies that are broad, that can apply to everyone. Because the other thing to remember is that disabilities, you can employ someone that has a disability when they start working for you, but disabilities can also be acquired, and the definition also can include like long-term chronic illnesses. So just keeping your policies broad, flexible, and able to be applied in a range of situations is the best way to ensure your policies are inclusive.
Perfect, thank you. We've got one more question at the moment. Is there a cost for your services, and how long does the training process last?
I could probably take that one, Gemma. There is a cost. So the actual initial assessment is free, and we really welcome everyone to go through that process, just because it really gives you an indication about where you are as an organization right now with your I guess your journey towards inclusion. But the cost is tailored basically because every organization that approaches us will be different. So you're going to be at different stages of that journey towards, being fully inclusive. So as we go through the assessment process and we create the action plan, then we'll be able to tailor a package that basically suits exactly where you're at as an employer. In terms of the duration, again, it depends on the needs of your learning and development, how many modules you might want to access. There may be things that you see in the modules that actually are relevant to you, and then there may be other things that we might not have covered in those modules, and we really want to give the opportunity to have a discussion around those things so that we can tailor things as well. So if there are things that literally, you're thinking, yeah, you haven't mentioned any of this stuff, but this is what we need, with our lived experience lens, we're really able to kind of sit down and talk through what you need. So How long is a piece of string is probably the answer to that, because we can tailor anything in terms of the package that is designed to kind of meet your needs as an employer.
Perfect. And then just one final one which has come through. I think you might have touched on this already in the presentation, but when you talk about flexibility as an example of a reasonable adjustment, what does this include?
I can jump in there, Phat. So there's obviously standard ones such as a shorter working day, you know, your job share, working from home. Obviously, working from home has become really accessible to people during COVID, and I think it's become kind of the new normal way of working, which is interesting because previously it probably wasn't adopted as widely. But there's also different ways as well that you can accommodate flexibility. So it could be a 9-day fortnight, for example, where a person is paid a full-time wage, but they're doing a 9-day for their hours over a 9-day fortnight. You could look at job share. You could look at potentially being able to do hours that might not necessarily be within business hours for work that doesn't have to be done during business hours. So there could be ability to work outside that 9 to 5, so to lengthen your business days. One of the things that we do is we have a Perth, like we have a lot of operations in Perth as well. So being able to structure those hours around the longer day to accommodate people's needs. You could look to locate someone in a different office if the office isn't accessible, for example. You could make sure that the office that has potentially better transport links is available. So there's a variety of ways that you can work to make a role flexible, and it doesn't have to be your traditional part-time working pattern or shorter day. There's a variety of different ways that you can accommodate it.
Perfect, thank you. That's all the questions for now.
Great, thanks, Libby. So thanks again for taking the time to join us. That's the webinar finished for today. If you want to learn more about today's topic, or if you'd like to register for one of those free disability status checks, the initial assessments that we mentioned before, get in touch. The contact details are on the screen right now, so you can email me directly at pngo@scia.org.au. We will be sending the slides out to all of the attendees on the webinar today, just in case you can't write those details down. But thanks so much again for joining us, and I hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you.